everyone with money says that they're Paris aligned, that they're working towards the SDGs, that they're committed to the Paris Agreement. But no one knew what that meant for our industry. And with our project, we were able to take the complexity from the IPC and the Danish legislation and national climate policy and simplify it down into a really clear narrative and a clear visualization of what we need to do. So we went from having only relative targets in the building industry in Denmark to now having absolute targets. So if we actually want to work within planetary limits, this is what we have to do. And it's quite shocking.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Dani Hill-Hansen. Dani is a sustainable design engineer and architect at Effect in Copenhagen, where she co-authored the Reduction Roadmap, a campaign and strategy to mobilize the building industry in Denmark, which is successfully lobbying politicians to legislate the industry in order to meet the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Accord. The Reduction Roadmap, which is supported by 580 stakeholders in the Danish building industry, shows that building emissions globally have to be reduced by 96% if we are to follow climate science and stay within the planetary boundaries. The Reduction Roadmap is lobbying politicians at the moment to legislate an emissions cap of carbon dioxide kilograms per meter squared. To me, it's just amazing that this target of absolute reduction is being spearheaded by the industry itself, who, as Dani explains, understand that in a world of limits to growth, there will still be huge room for innovation, creativity, and imagination. Because if we're living in a world where we try to reduce our waste, we're going to have to use our brains a little bit more to figure out how to do so. This is a really important story of how good things can be achieved by companies that are acting within an extractive and exploitative macroeconomic system, who can lead the charge and say, no, we want something different, we need something different, and we're going to show you how to do it. So all you need to do, politics, is just put it into law, which is why part of this project, amazingly, is not only developing the roadmap, but also developing a methodology of what they call brand activism, so that other industries can learn about the success of this project in Denmark and roll out similar campaigns. They have a website linked in the show notes where you can find out more about how they did this and how you might want to do this within your industry as well. This is a really, really exciting story. And even though the targets, like reducing our emissions by 96%, might seem immense, it just goes to show that grassroots organizing and the power of community are absolutely the way forward when it comes to navigating all of these crises. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Dani, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you. So before we get into the roadmap, what you've come on the show to discuss today, I would like to still ask you the first question that everybody gets, which is, why is the world in crisis?
It's a big question. And to me, the starting point is a disconnect from nature. I think we see ourselves as separate from other living species. And because of that, we don't appreciate them. We don't care about them. We have no real value for the living world. And that is a perfect breeding ground for capitalism and consumerism to thrive. So on the one end, we don't care about nature and we don't see ourselves as part of nature. And on the other end, we are fed a lie that having more things and more money will make us happy. And we are programmed that line from so early on that most of us still believe it, even if we're aware of the problems. It's really hard to sort of separate ourselves from this idea, and on a global scale that has been sold everywhere. So we are over consuming, under happy, disconnected from nature, and that's allowed it problem to escalate to a point where it's so big we don't know where to start to fix it.
Indeed. What was I saying on the news this morning? Oh, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, but it was something about how like one of the models that's used in I think it was in the IPCC report, like isn't taking into consideration this really massive possibly tipping point or something. Sorry, I'm not telling the story very well, everyone. It's one of these useless non-starter pieces of information. But just as you're saying, because it's so complex to model everything, what we're finding time and time and time again is that things are being left out in order to try and make sense of the complexity. But when you leave things out, you're not getting the full picture of the complexity.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's
disastrous.
basically the problem.
Yeah. So I think that is a nice segue into the roadmap. So please, how did this, who's it aimed for? Who's it aimed at?
Yeah.
And how did it come about?
Yeah. So I'm sitting in Copenhagen, Denmark. I work at an architecture firm. I'm an architect and sustainable design engineer. My work is primarily in the building industry, although we are talking to people in other sectors now. But the project came about a few years ago. My colleagues here at Effect were trying to find out if we can actually make homes that are healthy for people and the planet. And we have a gigantic issue across the board, also in other sectors, that all of our sustainability frameworks and certifications and all the things people use to sort of benchmark projects are based on relative sustainability. So you might be improving from design A to design B, but we actually don't know if something's within planetary limits. So they wanted to find out, how can we design something that's actually good for the planet? What would the planetary limit be? And with that kind of broad question and sort of naive start, that went to find out. And we're very surprised that no one had answered that question yet. That there wasn't a limit set for the building industry, or even really for Denmark, like that we didn't have this knowledge documented anywhere. And so that was kind of the starting point. Fast forward maybe a few months, the team here at Effect reached out online through LinkedIn to find out who else might be interested in finding out. And when they started collaborating with some other companies or private companies on the project. So I'm sitting at Effect Architects. We partnered with Zebra Architects and Artilia Engineering. At the same time, going into this project, we knew that in order to answer this question, we had to work with experts sitting at universities. So we had to go outside of the building industry and talk to people who had expertise in setting absolute targets and planetary boundary, basic understanding of that model and the science behind it. So yeah, that was like the starting point, was to find that out. And it was about a 8 months process or maybe a year from when that initial question came, into the world, to when we actually launched the project. So that was the starting point of the project.
Amazing. Wow. I'm actually almost even surprised that 8 months seems quite an amazing turnaround for a project that is undoubtedly complex. You must be looking at materials for building and supply chains and, everything.
Yes and no is less. The project is more about setting the target. So today we have an average for what we build for in Denmark, like the average emissions of housing. And we needed to find out, where do we need to go? So in order to do that, we had to start on a global level and through the process of allocation, take the global carbon budget that's remaining and scale that down from global level down to Denmark, down to the building industry, and then down to specific like building typologies. And in order to do that, we needed to have researchers actually define the safe operating space based on the planetary boundary model for climate change. And this project is rooted in climate change and carbon emissions because that is one, how we measure impact of buildings generally, and it's where one of our big emissions lie. Of course, we have a huge biodiversity crisis that we are now sort of starting to figure out how do we actually set targets for biodiversity as well. But the starting point was climate change. And what we found out through that research and the work that the university did was that on a global level, we need to reduce our emissions by 96% to get within the safe operating space for the Earth. So,
sorry, is that just for the building industry?
Well, it comes down and it's around 96% to the building sector. But on a global level, if you look at the emissions we have today and then the safe operating space for Earth, where Earth is in balance, it can kind of sequester as much as is emitted in 1 year, we have to reduce by 96% on a global level.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that is
a lot.
Very different
Yeah.
from like the IPCC or...
Yeah. It's, what we did actually is we used that in the project. We wanted to use the existing frameworks that we have. So Danish building legislation, Danish national commitments to the Paris Agreement 1.5 warming degree scenario, the standard way we measure buildings through LCA, and, look at these sort of frameworks that already exist and figure out if we understand these limits that are set in the science that is documented in the IPCC, so the 1.5 warming degree scenario, that gives us a specific budget for carbon emissions that are remaining before we, go beyond that threshold. And if we use those budgets, that gives us an actual timeline for getting in with Earth's safe operating space. And what we found out is that on a global level and also in the Danish building industry, we had between 7 and 10 years to reduce emissions by 96%, which is quite catastrophic. That's really not a lot of time. And so what we proposed was a step-down approach. So every year reducing emissions by 10% to get within that safe operating space. We did the reduction this way because in Denmark, in our building industry, we are fortunate that we have a piece of legislation that actually sets a carbon limit on the amount of carbon that can be in a square meter of our buildings. So we actually have legislation in place that is meant to limit impact of our buildings. When that legislation...
The carbon footprint of a building.
Okay. Exactly. So that legislation has been in effect since 2023. So we've had it for a year, but that limit is set quite high. On average, our buildings emit 9.5 kilos of carbon per square meter per year, and that limit is set to 12. So it's way above the average. So today it's superficial. It's important that we have it in the legislation because right now in our second phase of the project, we've actually been running a campaign to align that legislation with our commitment to the Paris Agreement. Because with our project, we could see, okay, the Paris Agreement level is way down here and our building legislation is way up here. So we could show through visual communication that if we are actually to follow through with the Paris Agreement, which the country has committed to, and every big corporation, every big engineering house, everyone with money says that they're Paris aligned, that they're working towards the SDGs, that they're committed to the Paris Agreement. But no one knew what that meant for our industry. And with our project, we were able to take the complexity from the IPCC and the Danish legislation and national climate policy and simplify it down into a really clear narrative and a clear visualization of what we need to do. So we went from having only relative targets in the building industry in Denmark to now having absolute targets. So if we actually want to work within planetary limits, this is what we have to do. And it's quite shocking. And in June of 23, the data from the IPCC report was updated. And a shocker to no one, in the 2 years between, or the 3 years between the data from the IPCC and the updated report, we have not reduced, but we have escalated global emissions. What this means effectively is that carbon budget for a 1.5 warming degree scenario has been cut in half. So has our timeline. So then we were looking at the timeline. Instead of being 7 to 10 years, we now have 3 to 7 years to get within the safe operating space, which is a 96% reduction from business as usual today. So we have been able to show our industry in really clear terms where we need to go. And the project has less been about how do we get there, what materials and all of that stuff. We do have really good examples of how to get there, but it's really about fundamentally changing the purpose of buildings, because to reduce by 96%, we need to do much more than change our building materials. We also need to build a lot less. And that's like the reality that we face today, that like a building stop or setting limitations to how much we build is the future if we want to be within planetary limits. It's like, shouldn't be shocking that we can't continue consuming, but it's really useful to have the data and to show it in numbers and clear communication so that it's harder to argue against, and it's harder to keep going with business as usual when we can now show very clearly what is the right path and what is the wrong path.
I've got so many questions.
Yeah. It's a really dorky, data-heavy project. So it's like the way that we have done it and the way we have made it easy to communicate is through visual communication and using our architectural skills to make like really clear graphics and a visual world that communicates all of it. So I always feel like we're really missing that tool when I'm just talking about it.
Yeah. I just want to go back to this 96%. Can you walk us through some more of like the details on how you guys reached this figure?
Oh boy, there's a whole report on it that was written by the researchers at the Danish universities, and it's quite complex. So I will butcher like a technical explanation. But basically, if you look at like the planetary boundaries framework, you have in the middle the safe operating space. That's Earth, and that's Earth's capacity, right, to balance emissions. What we put out, it can take back in, right? We have long exceeded that limit, for almost a century. We have been beyond that limit. And when you look at the planetary boundaries drawing, you can see on climate change that we are way outside of that safe operating space. And what they were able to do using the science and like the data from the Stockholm Resilience Center was update that figure to figure out how much do we need to reduce our climate change or carbon emissions to be within the safe operating space. So they've done that through like a highly technical process that I cannot explain, to be honest. We have a paper though where it is explained and then go through the methodology. My role in the project is communication and steering the work. So we release a lot of that really nerdy technical stuff to people who are experts in it that we work closely with. But yeah.
Do you think we'll find a way to maybe upload that report online and then link it in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a whole website for the project where we have the background report that goes through our allocation process. It has the safe operating space paper by Stephen Peterson and a few other researchers. So we have all the information there. It's easily accessible. Yeah. So we can definitely link to that.
Let's do so. So, I mean, funnily enough, the next thing that comes to my mind is jobs. Like, this is such a reckoning in every industry, isn't it? That cannot, just grow infinitely forever. But even then, there's a difference between exponential growth and reducing by 96%. I mean, how is the industry in Denmark, responding to this? Because it's huge.
Yeah, I think we're in a process of reconciliation. I think it hasn't really hit everyone at the same speed what it means. the whole first phase of our project was about telling this story and communicating out this is what we need to do. We need to reduce, and like setting a very clear target. The whole second phase of our project from September 23 and is ongoing now is a campaign where we have mobilized the industry to ask politicians to align the building legislation with the Paris Agreement for 2025. So what that would do is take the emissions limit, which today is 12 kilos of carbon per square meter per year, and cut that in half. It should be under 5.8 if we want to align with the Paris Agreement. And we have successfully mobilized the biggest actors in the industry. We have over 580 organizations that have signed a letter, basically, of support that we have been able to take to the highest level of the political space in Denmark. And so on the one hand, people are reacting because they want the change and they know we can do it. At least for 2025, like a year from now, we could build within that limit and have to do some material innovation. And we have to use life cycle assessment to aid our decision making so we are more informed about the impact of what we're doing. But it's not unreasonable. We have the materials and the technology to design for that today. When it comes to the next phase of, basically carbon neutral buildings, we don't have that technology and it doesn't exist. So this is where we have to confront the reality that we need to build less. And we're working on that phase of the research now to kind of make a degrowth plan for the industry. I would say in general, the way people, I'm unsure of what the reaction will be to that. The last half a year, we have been communicating out that it's possible for us to reduce the amount we need for 2025, but we haven't communicated out or found out what do we need to do after that. And the only reasonable thing we can do is to build less and to move towards a building system that's based on sufficiency. What do we need? What benefits society? What don't we need? How much should we be building each year? And make decisions from a place of need compared to a place of excess.
It's so interesting because these are normally conversations I would say that I'm having with people on the theoretical level, like academics, social scientists, economists, and to have it coming from within an industry is really exciting.
As far
but
as
also the timbre feels different.
Yeah, as far as we know, it's the first time in an industry has come together and asked for stricter legislation. We don't know of a different precedent where an industry like the people commercial side has actually said we want stricter regulation and we want it now and we're ready for it. So it is a pretty, I think, unprecedented movement and mobilization of an industry. And I think it's, we don't know yet what the building limit is going to be. Again, it's just one small piece of all the things in our building legislation and all the things that sort of dictate what we can do. And then also, of course, if you understand the science, you know that what we should do is to stop building today.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of reconciliation between this is really amazing and it's a good movement and it's incredible that we have so many people on board. We also don't really know what's going to happen after because if the building legislation isn't set at this limit, people are not obligated to do the right thing, right? And that's the thing about legislation, which is, oftentimes it prohibits us in design, but it also is a lever that makes it an equal playing field. It changes the market, makes it possible for bio-based materials and smaller companies to actually compete with the, business as usual, large material manufacturers. So it's a really important piece of our legislation that has made it possible to do this.
Could you explain that in a little bit more detail, please?
I mean, in general, building legislation has the possibility, particularly when we set a carbon limit on what we can build, to change the landscape of buildings. Today, that limit is set so high that you don't have to think about your design at all to build within it. And what we're saying is we need to cut it in half. When we do that, and we're aligned with the Paris Agreement, it creates a space for low carbon materials to actually come on the market. Today, the concrete producers and the rock wool producers and the ones making heavy emitting materials are dominant in the marketplace because they have been around a long time. They are cheaper than other materials, and they have like a dominant force in the marketplace. But when we set the right legislation, it actually requires us to innovate and to use low carbon materials and to use local materials. And it creates a even playing field for the smaller material manufacturers that today have the right solutions ready, but no one's using them because it's too expensive or because they're not really being required to design low carbon construction. So it makes it fair. Also, on a commercial level, if everyone has the same limit and has to go through the same innovation push, no one is being hindered. Today, there are pilot projects, and there are some companies that go and make ultra low carbon, like spec houses, or these great projects that show the possibility, but it's hard to scale those because today they cost more. Where if we change the legislation, it becomes an even playing field, basically. It makes it easier for the right materials to come to the market, it makes it easier for people to innovate, and it basically makes it fair. It's an innovation push, So it's something that we need for companies to do the right thing within the existing economic, frameworks.
I have a math question.
Oh, boy.
Because there's a bit of the math. Well, no, I don't actually. There's a bit of the math that doesn't seem to be mathing.
Okay.
And that is, if we need to reduce by 96%, then doing a push from the 12 kilogram CO2 limit that is currently in legislation that is only on average being used at 9 kilograms, then bringing that down to 5.8, that's not a 96% reduction.
No, it's because our reduction curve, you could say, is a stepped linear curve, which means each year you reduce a little bit. And when we look at our data for 2025, that's at 5.8. If we fast forward 3 years, we're at 0.3. Right. So we had a nice stair in our first version of the reduction roadmap. That was a 10% reduction over 10 years. And then when that budget is cut in half, the area of that stair is cut in half. So now we're looking at something that more looks like a ladder than a stair. So in 2025, the point that overlays between our first roadmap and the second roadmap with the updated data in 25 is this 5.8. So we are not talking about looking beyond 2025 because that's the legislation that the politicians are setting today. And we know that in another year or another 2 years, when that data is updated, we won't have a carbon budget left. So it's like the last chance to use this framework that we've developed to impact the legislation in a meaningful way. What happens after 25? We don't know. But yes, the math was not mathing because the real, like the safe operating space is 0.3, which is basically 0. And we don't have technology like that doesn't exist. So if we have a small carbon budget left, what we should do is build a lot less, and then that number goes up. Because right now our reduction is based on a constant rate of construction. So if we build less, then maybe our limit goes up to 1 or 1.5. And there we might actually be able to innovate to have like ultra low carbon by reusing the existing building stock, doing biogenic transformations of what we have. So then we start to get to a space where it's realistic. But if we keep building as much as we do today, we'll completely blow it. There's no way we can get within that safe operating space.
What is the difference between building something from scratch versus retrofitting something that already exists?
I mean, if you look at the full material life cycle of a building, from raw material extraction, manufacturing, transportation, putting it all together on the building site where hopefully the materials and all the resources are stored for 50 to 100 years. And then at some point, those materials, the building gets decommissioned or parts get replaced, and then they go somewhere else. Whether they get recirculated into use again or they go into a landfill, we don't know. But if you look at all the embodied energy, so that's all the carbon that is embedded in all those materials, we want to keep as much of that as possible where it is. So if we reuse a building that's already standing, where those materials still work, they have the same aesthetic and structural properties that we need to use the building, we reduce the overall emissions of that building's footprint by doing a transformation of the existing building stock, because we're not taking new resources from faraway places, exacerbating, the climate crisis. So it's really about minimizing the footprint and just valuing what we already have. It's really, we need to realize that what we have, maybe it's out of style, or maybe it needs some replacing, or maybe there are things that you need to do if it becomes a different type of building from an office to a home, for example. Yes, you maybe need to add new material layers, but we have to do our best to keep what's there.
Yeah, it seems to me that it could be like a really exciting path for innovation. Like imagine if we had, people doing masters in like retrofitting architecture, and that became like the really cool new thing.
Yeah.
Because it's such an interesting problem solve every time, rather than, having these like massive creative flourishes of like these buildings that may be beautiful to look at, but are only designed for one thing ever.
Yeah.
And often it seems in modern times fall down quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we don't usually design things in high quality. We design them to be used for a short time, even though the materials themselves have a lot of aesthetic and natural wealth. And then we take them apart. And, so long as we don't set limits to growth, also in the building industry, we're going to keep throwing things away because that's how we sustain the economy. So what we really need to do is define, a degrowth plan also for the building industry, where we have limits and we have to focus on using what we have. And we use local materials, whether that's materials sourced from the existing building stock and upcycling them, or, biogenic materials grown in a way that is healthy for the planet and doesn't exacerbate, biodiversity crisis and land use issues. And, we have to be careful in the future not to make the same mistakes as we do today with our, industrial farming.
There was a degrowth paper that was published recently, and it took the average sustainable and high quality lifestyle index stuff and said, okay, if we give everybody in the world, 8 billion people, access to this high quality life, what does that look like? What can we use? What will our footprint be? How can we give everybody on Earth a good life? And it was really interesting because they found that it's very much only like the bottom end of that high quality life that they can manage. There's no room for excess or luxury at all. It's very much sufficiency. And one of the things that stood out to me was that every building would have to be made out of wood. We have to kiss goodbye to concrete.
Yeah, it's really, 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 really dangerous what was in that report. If they only talked about bio-based materials as a solution, I think, it's a huge problem. Right now, we are trying to get funding to start a new project where we can actually set like baseline understanding of what the impact of our buildings are on biodiversity, because low carbon building materials are bad for biodiversity. Right?
You mean like cutting down timber in order to make wood?
The way it's produced today. There's, of course, better ways of producing material. There are better ways of forestry. There's better ways of, handling material or growing it more locally. But in general, we just look at the mainstream practice for how we get timber today. It's terrible for the climate. It's just as bad as concrete. So, when we overlay these things and look at the high carbon materials and ones that are low on biodiversity, we would probably find is that we need fast growing, like rapidly renewable, local grasses and wheats and, hemp that are good for storing carbon, but they're also like useful as building materials. So we have to be really careful, because if you only look at carbon, of course, the impact is terrible for biodiversity. And anyone who is saying that like turning to timber as like just replacing all the construction systems we have today with wood is, missing it. I think, again, we really need limits to growth. We need to use what we have. Of course, timber is part of the solution, but not if we keep building as much as we do today. Then we are still depleting Earth's resources and going, closer and closer to total climate collapse.
It's interesting. I'll have to dig out the report and also link this here, because they were also looking at planetary boundaries.
Yeah.
So this like sustainable life and planetary boundaries, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
And they found that the sort of industrialized, modernized, industry of building just could not continue, and it would have to be wood. But to me as well, it stuck out to me, because I went, yeah, but what about but where, what? But where do we get all that wood from?
Yeah. Just magically appearing. What is timber is fast growing and plenty of land.
Yeah, endlessly renewable, which is not the case. But it is, I think it is interesting as a layman in all of this, how like still we are getting to slightly different conclusions quite a lot of the time.
All the time.
Depending on what data we look at, because it's so complex. And yet the one thing that everyone agrees on is, well, we need to reduce, if not stop altogether.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I sometimes wonder if like these sort of substitutable options is essentially just a distraction from, this is what we have to work with what we have, and that's it. No extra going forward.
I mean, I think it's always, as long as we are stuck in the same macroeconomic system that's dependent on growth, we will see systems of production that follow that demand, so if we stop building, there's whole industries that, then what do they do? If you look at our building industry, it's like, well, we still need infrastructure. There will still be new buildings that we need, but not as often. We have to think about all of the technology, all the skills we have, and channel it towards new types of projects. We need to adapt our surroundings for climate change. We need to invest in public infrastructure. We need to regenerate and transform the existing building stock. There is an immense need for transformation of the existing building stock, particularly in Europe, where we have tons and tons and tons of old buildings that we need to figure out how to transform and continue to use. So it's not like the industry has to die, the industry has to pivot. Like, we have so many good skills, we collaborate on every project, we know how to work with other people. It's just a matter of creating new economic systems and new business plans for our pension funds and private developers, so that they stop seeing their job as storing money and new housing and consider, buying the existing buildings that are sitting empty, let's say in the Danish countryside or wherever you are, there's empty buildings, and figuring out how to turn those into a new type of revenue. Like, we just have to think in a new way. And I'm afraid that if we don't actually set limits to growth, that won't happen.
It's very easy to make money when your economic model is kind of predicated on never mind the waste.
Yeah.
And you can just grow and grow and grow and grow and grow forever.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting what you're saying, I love that phrase, stop seeing their job as storing money.
Yeah.
It's an amazing phrase. And I think it's really interesting because it kind of reveals that in a limits to growth world, we are going to need to use much, much, much more innovation and imagination and creative capacity in order to figure out how to not only lead a good life, but lead one that really meets all of the requirements that one would think a biological organism sort of should have for being alive. And when you stop using a fuel that burns off 40% of itself as heat, when you stop producing things that it's okay if they fall down in 20 years because, hey, that's just more GDP because we'll just commission another one. You know, when you stop thinking like that, you have to use more of your brain.
Yeah, we do need to use more of our brain, and we need to actually just think about what we want. I think so often people question degrowth, like, how will that work? It's like, look at the existing system. It's not working. No one is happy. We're all stressed out and tired. People work way more than they should and still don't have enough money. It's like, you know, the youth are questioning this. They get it. If they're the ones in the streets protesting, they're the ones who are saying no to going to university to work for people who don't have their interest in mind. You know, so I think there's a transition happening, and the youngest people give me hope because they can see that like the current system is garbage and it's not ever going to help them. And it's like, it's I think the transition will come. I'm optimistic that it can happen, but it's really about, you know, if people would just take the time, like if everyone was given a week off from work to just think about whether or not like this is working for them. You know, we're so busy. Everyone's in this hustle culture where we running from home to pick up the kids, make the food, to put the kids to bed, to then do a little more work, to then go to work the next day. No one has time to even question whether or not it's working. You know, and the moment you face that, I think you can start to imagine a world where you get to work less and you get to spend more time with your family, and where you don't have to order out food, but you actually grow food and you cook healthy things. And it's like the promise of a society that is built around the principles of degrowth is that everyone's life is just happier. You know, it's easier. It's more of what we need and less of what we don't need. And I think the work we are doing now is to try and bring that reality to our Danish building industry here and show that like this doesn't mean that we stop working. It means that we work on other things, and that those things benefit our own lives. They benefit the planet, and they are not, you know, ruining our children's future. You know,
it's like moving from a culture of work to a culture of service. Or stewardship.
Stewardship is the best way to say it.
Yeah. I like when these conversations come back to people's sort of well-being, because, you know, we're talking about carbon budgets, and we're talking about limits to growth, and we're talking about economics, and we're talking about the IPCC report. But what we're really talking about is the fact that everything has gone mad and nobody is well. You know, like the planet is, our climate and biodiversity, all of these like planetary boundaries, they are unwell, they are sick, they have been pushed into distress and disease, and us along with it.
Yeah, and so we're, I mean, it's not working.
It's not working.
No.
It's not. I saw this clip on Twitter the other day, and it was this psychiatrist, and he was talking, I think he mostly works with men, and he was talking about like the rates of suicide or like suicidal ideation amongst men today. And what he said was, you know, we're treating this as, and mental health more generally, as a symptom of a disease, of something being wrong with somebody's brain. Whereas actually these men are having a very rational reaction to a very bad life. They cannot see a way out. It's not that they've got bad brain chemistry. It's not that they've got congenital defects. It's not that they have a mental health disorder. They are perfectly healthy. It's just that their life is not worth living. That is what we have created in modern society. And
I often feel this way as, you know, like, how can people not be angry or depressed or sad? Like, if you are not feeling those things and you're not aware of what's going on, or you're living in complete disillusion, I often think that people who are not depressed and just like going about their days, like I think maybe something's wrong with you. Like, if you just take a moment to see what's going on, there's no way to not be impacted by it. It's, I think Glennon Doyle talks about it. She has mental illness and depression and things, and she talks about it as her being like a sensitive person, that she's actually aware of the problems in the world. And they've impacted her whole life. She has felt like something is wrong in the world. And the older you get and the more wise you get, you realize that those feelings are real and they're legitimate because the world is fucked up. And it's like accepting that the world is fucked up is not the end point. We have to change it. But it's at least an acceptance you can have with yourself to say, there's nothing wrong with me. There's something wrong with the world.
Yeah.
And that is liberating to hear other people say that, to hear people talk about it, and to say like, no, it's crazy that people are not reacting. It's not crazy that I'm talking about, climate change and protesting. It's crazy that you are not.
Yeah. And to be honest, I would like to also flip it and offer a little bit of, I don't know, maybe an antidote or a soothing, a salve to anyone listening. Like, I have found that doing this work and confronting the most distressing problems of the world around me has totally liberated my own mental health.
Yeah.
Like, it's gone from being something that, how do I put this? It's gone from being something that felt problematic within myself, like my problem, my relationship to the world, and actually quite me in a sense through my 20s, to being like, oh no, that was always a normal reaction to what was going on. The world is mad. And the more I learn, the more I feel empowered, and the more people I speak to, the better I feel.
Yeah.
And so there is this sense of like, when you first confront the information, I think, and most people kind of talk about this, like for the first year or two, it can be a lot and almost too much, and to kind of like be drowning under the weight of everything that's going wrong in the world. But then you can start to come out through the other side as well, because you realize that as an individual, there is nothing essentially that you can do, but as a networked individual within a community, which then begins to provide all of that social infrastructure that automatically benefits our social, mental, emotional, spiritual well-being, then it becomes a kind of like exponential, positive curve as well. In the, you start doing stuff that helps the world, you start feeling better within yourself as well. At least that has been my experience. And I think that that's an important message as well to share to people, because it's worth getting involved and getting your hands dirty, because I think it will help you overall.
Agreed. I think it's really tough work to do. It's hard work to like fight systems of oppression and be yelling all the time, or not yelling, but speaking out, it is
yell.
tough work. I just sometimes like, this is really hard work, but if I wasn't doing it, I don't think I could be living. Like, I wouldn't be here, because I would just be feel so trapped. I had a period where I wasn't working with the stuff I am now, and I had to do like a big pivot in my career to make a space for myself where I could actually take on these problems and work towards having impact, because I just felt like I cannot know all of this and not be doing something about it. And then doing something about it isn't easy, but it's worth it, because once you know the problems, if you don't actually find a way to navigate through them or to contribute to a solution, that can be really hard too. So I think for a lot of people who are stuck in a job where they feel it's misaligned with their purpose and they aren't sure if they can keep doing it, it's like we have to also create space for those people, that it's like some people just have to work to support their family and are at a place where they can pivot in their careers, or aren't privileged enough to design their own projects or to lead, movements, that those people also need outlets, whether that's through groups or, protesting or whatever it is that is like important, that for people who don't yet have a position in the world where their work or their stewardship is aligned with their purpose or their desire to change the world, that like if it is an option, you can like eventually you can get there, but not to feel like a bad person because you can't.
Absolutely. And I think we need to widen that concept of stewardship as well, because it's so often talked about, like we talk about planetary stewardship, which is problematic now that I think about it for the very first time, really, because like the planet doesn't need our stewardship. The planet just needs us to stop touching it. It's like we're like a bunch of we're like a bunch of children running around, and Mother Earth is just like, put that down. Will you just put it down, But this idea that essentially we need to steward ourselves if we're going to enjoy a healthy planet, like that's the planetary stewardship there. Yeah. But people can do it at home as well. I totally agree with you. And thank you for making space for people who cannot leave their jobs and don't feel that their sense of stewardship is aligned with a purpose, and are trapped in a mortgage, which is debt. We shouldn't really call it a mortgage. It's trapped in debt. You've got kids, you need to feed them, all this kind of stuff. Good luck with that. But I think even something simple like go and steward, I don't know, your local community garden. Go and steward a vegetable patch. Go and steward your friends' kids on the weekend, and like just be with them. There are things that it is really important that we all begin to consider the things that we can do for ourselves. Because I mean, I think what is the stat around like the amount of the hours of television watched in a day? Like we're all sitting in front of screens at work. Yeah. And then I think it's like 4 hours of Netflix or something an evening on average in some countries around the world. That's wild. And I get it, right? I get why you want to numb out after a really tough day. If anyone's interested, in 2024, my numbing out thing has been, an episode or two of Buffy the Vampire Slayer at night. Yeah. Because that was a cultural wave that I missed when I was younger. Okay. Thanks. No judgment.
I'm that shitty reality television to is my worries to disassociate.
Everybody does it. Yeah. One of the people who I love most, who I've done through doing this work, and who I respect so much, and he's got such a brilliant brain. He called me up recently and he was like, oh man, The Traitors, it's such good TV. I was like, I can't believe you're watching The Traitors. Yeah. He's like, I need to, 1 hour a day, like just got to switch off. So I get it. Like, and we're all doing it. But also make time for these other forms of stewardship that will make you feel better as well. Because this is the thing, this like degrowth lifestyle, it's not just figuring out a reduction in emissions and kilograms per square footage, and it's about how we choose to live with each other. And I think that's why it's so exciting that this is coming from industry itself. 580 organizations, and it goes to show that there is a lot of forward thinking even in private industry, outside of sort of governmental agencies. And I personally am really, really excited for, I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but I have seen like news reports of other industries being like, well, please, somebody regulate us. Like we're willing to do the innovation and do the work if you just regulate us. So tell me, I know we've just gone off on a really lovely sort of personal tangent about degrowth, which I have to say I love. But to bring it back to the topic of discussion, have you gotten interest from people? Are you speaking with people outside of Denmark at the moment? Like what's the plan to make this global? Yes. And also what are some of the pushbacks that you're getting that you're having to navigate?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, we've had an overwhelming amount of people from other places reaching out to say, how do we do this in Australia? How do we do it in Sweden? How do we do it here? So within like different building industries, but we're also talking to people who would like to do the same for other sectors. And right now we're in the process of pivoting away from being like a private company run project to try to become more of like a nonprofit organization so that we have better access to funding and that kind of thing so we can scale up our impact. So we're working in that direction to figure out how can we give ourselves a easier time economically, because until now it's been a major investment from the companies that are involved along with some philanthropic donations, but it's been resource tight. So I think a big step for us moving forward is to work in other spaces, because the approach to allocation and the approach to communication and the approach to mobilization are all things other people can learn from and duplicate anywhere in any sector. You just need kind of the right data and the right network of people around your project. So that's kind of like the future. There will be more roadmaps. And I just want to briefly touch on the positives of what have happened in the process and the challenges, particularly in the phase of mobilization. In the first phase of the reduction roadmap, we have used branded activism, just kind of creating an actual brand for this project has been quite successful, that everyone knows it. It's a recognizable name. It's in the press and media. It's very clear to see the project on LinkedIn and in the newspapers, and people know what it is. So we've created like a recognizable and known brand for the project within our industry, which has created an immense amount of success, I think. Another thing we've done is going from the minority insights, so like the data, the IPCC report, all this stuff that's kind of locked in the brains of really smart scientists and researchers and universities and stuck there because no one speaks that language. And we've just kind of lifted it from these spaces and communicated it out in a way that speaks to our own industry. And that has been successful because what was hidden in 400 pages of a IPCC report, it's now tied directly to legislation that everyone here has to abide by. So making that visual, going from the majority, like minority insights to majority action, has been a big part of what we've done. And another thing I think that has been positive is figuring out how to work with people across industries and across expertise. If it was just architects working on this project, we wouldn't have succeeded. We needed to work with researchers who have different perspectives. We needed to work with engineers. And through this mobilization process, we have worked with people who are political strategists. We have worked with different unions and people who represent the workers. And we have kind of branched out from our core team to working with diverse actors across the entire building value chain who are helping support the mission, which I think has been really successful. And being able to speak multiple languages and kind of translate between these different spaces has been one of the major successes of the project. And I think in our first phase of the roadmap, we created the data, we showed how far off we were, but no one really knew what to do about it. So engineers were sitting around the different engineering houses, architects, sitting and looking and saying, okay, this is actually where we need to go, but we don't have clients who are asking for it. So we might have this knowledge as consultants, but unless the right projects are on the table, it's not going to happen. So having a simple ask in this phase of the roadmap where we've managed to mobilize the industry, we asked people to support that our building legislation should align with the Paris Agreement. That is an important ask. It's a simple, important ask because every single company at some point or other, somewhere buried in their reports or on the very front of their websites, say that they're working towards the Paris Agreement. If we had a specific data point, if we had written climate science, if we had different language there, we probably would have had fewer people supporting the call to action. But because people are already committed to that, and we've used that as an important point of leverage. I think the other thing that we have done well is that we have, through this process, created solutions for people rather than problems. So we have collected building cases that show this is the way forward, we can do it. We have enabled people sitting at different companies. There has been some of the large companies that have signed on, has not been because the CEO at the top wanted to do it. It's because we presented to their engineers and they got a signatures of 100 engineers and project managers who said, we will leave this company if you don't support this action. So people have mobilized on different levels. So we've given solutions to people who are feeling disempowered by their work, where they can actually get together and then say, let's join this collectively. And when it comes to talking to the politicians and like specifically mobilizing within the parliament, which we have also been doing, is showing them data that is useful for them. They don't care so much about the Paris Agreement. We thought they would. We thought it would be a big win for the politicians to say we've aligned to the Paris Agreement and our building legislation. But as it turns out, they're not so worried about that. They're worried about meeting the reduction targets based on our climate policy. So we took our data and translated that into data that they could use. We found out if the building legislation was aligned with the 5.8 ask, the building industry would deliver 20% of the needed carbon reduction for 2025, which is not like we're not a sector, like a reporting sector in Denmark. We're an industry. So that means politicians aren't even looking at buildings, even if we have a big impact, when they are figuring out who needs to reduce the most. So we kind of delivered this gift to them to say, this helps you politically if you do it. And I think we have been very lucky in this process that we've had this point in our building legislation, which took 5 years of hard work by other activists to get a limit set in our building legislation. And although the limit today is superficial, it's an important leverage point that the whole success hinges on. If we reduce that limit, it has a major impact. And then the final thing, I think, which is really important and something we have it's been a battle. It's been a struggle. We've had so much discussion about the climate science says we should reduce now. Why are we setting this superficial limit in 2025? Well, we should stop building now. So we've had to really kind of reconcile and compromise and understand that what we can do right now within the current system is actually a really, really important and big step. Gathering all these people together and having their support, mobilizing the whole industry is a huge step. And even if it's not completely aligned with climate science in that we should stop building today, we are honest, like it's a trajectory that we're setting and we're moving people kind of one step at a time. And I think these processes are political, they're challenging, and it's important to understand that you have to have your goal in mind while taking like incremental steps to get there. And then that's not giving up, but it's using the current system to actually enact change. And then the final, I think, success of this, and it's important, and it's something probably you will appreciate with your background in journalism, but we have managed to like really be alive in the media. We have managed to uncover some of the like bad lobbying that is going on in our industry. We have been in a public debate with the biggest lobbying organization in Denmark, who have actively worked against our project, even though we're members of their organization. So they have gone out and made like false papers that they have delivered to politicians that make our project seem illegitimate. And we have been given those by people who want change. So we have known about it, and we actually put it out there into the public that they were working against climate change and, working against this movement, that they were trying to stall progress. And to me, if there's no other success, having a clear example of the power structures, calling them out is one really important step to dismantling that power. Now there are organizations that are ready to leave this huge, lobbying group. They're ready to leave and go somewhere else, and it's given them really bad PR, which quite frankly they deserve. And it hasn't just been us doing it. There has been people working on behalf of the project and behalf of our future to make sure that people who are working against this are called out publicly. And it's created a discussion in our industry that otherwise would be really hard to have. And I would say all of those things that have happened, we're hoping to get funding to make an ebook so other people can actually just like go and follow these same steps and points using this project as a case. So that will be coming. But in the meantime, my colleague Casper is working on a project Tipping Points with Reviz, which is an online course, and they are activating people around the globe to lead movements like this, which I think the impact of the project can go far beyond the building industry if people can use it as a case for the steps you have to take in your own context with your own problem you're trying to solve to mobilize people for climate justice.
Oh, Dani, I could sit and speak to you all day about this, all of the ins and outs and the intricacies, and I'm sure we've only scratched the surface. But
Yes.
what an amazing feat! You've gotten an industry essentially to revolutionize itself, and I just think that's really, really wonderful. And it is a shining example of what can be done when stakeholders come together with a longer term plan for the future. So, well done! It's awesome.
Thank you.
My final question for you is: who would you like to platform?
I knew you would ask this. I had a hard time thinking of a particular person, but I would platform anyone who is leading a youth movement, like a young person, someone who is not known, someone who has no work experience, but someone who is fighting for our future. Because I think the young people get it, and there is a lot of them stepping into leadership positions. You know, of course, Greta is like the shining example, but, you know, a lot of youth are following her lead and like championing really big initiatives. And we cannot do this without them. So I would say find that next Greta, the other big voice that's leading something important, because I think we can learn a lot from them. They are less entrapped in the system. And I think they see the world much clearer than, you know, it took me 30 years to see the world for what it is, and they are getting it quite early.
All right. Dani, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been a really, really nice discussion. And just want to say, I think, I don't know if it was your end of the year episode or New Year's, but you are kind of reflecting on some questions. And one of the things you said was about like that there's actually something worth fighting for. And that has carried me because, you know, it's easy to forget. It's easy to feel like giving up or to feel, why am I even doing this? It's over. And it's like, no, we are fighting for something. We are fighting for a future. We are fighting for a beautiful planet. We are fighting for life that will be better. And that was a really beautiful way of saying, like, why do we do it? There is something we are fighting for. It's important to remember.
I'm so pleased. We're fighting for each other and everything else.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my window. There's blue skies. Fighting for that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dani.
Yes, thank you.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.